All right, we're back. Welcome back to Black Bear News, where we are discussing climate change, destruction of a biosphere, our biosphere, belonging to planet Earth and all the living creatures upon said planet. All right, we're going to get into this article here titled "The Insect Apocalypse is Here." This is from the New York Times Magazine. This is by Brooke Jarvis. Soon boy Reese was on a bike ride with his youngest son, enjoying the sun slanting over the fields and woodlands near their home north of Copenhagen, when it suddenly occurred to him that something about the experience was amiss. Specifically, something was missing. It was summer. He was out in the country, moving fast, but strangely, he wasn't eating any bugs. For a moment, Reese was transported to his childhood on the Danish island of Lolland in the Baltic Sea. Back then, summer bike rides meant closing his mouth to cruise through thick clouds of insects, but inevitably, he swallowed some anyway. When his parents took him driving, he remembered the car's windshield was frequently so smeared with insect carcasses that you almost couldn't see through it. But all that seemed distant now. He couldn't recall the last time he needed to wash bugs from his windshield. He even wondered vaguely whether car manufacturers had invented some fancy new coating to keep off insects. But this absence, he now realized with some alarm, seemed to be all around him. Where had all the insects gone? And when? And why hadn't he noticed? Reese watched his son flying through the beautiful day, not eating bugs, and was struck by the melancholy thought that his son's childhood would lack this particular bug-eating experience of his own. It was, he granted, an odd thing to feel nostalgic about. But he couldn't shake a feeling of loss. I guess it's pretty human to think that everything was better when you were a kid, he said, but maybe I didn't like it when I was on my bike and I ate all the bugs. But looking back on it, I think it's something everybody should experience. I met Reese, a lanky high school science and math teacher, on a hot day in June. He was anxious about not having yet written his address for the school's graduation ceremony that evening. But first, he had a job to do. From his garage, he retrieved a large insect net, drove to a nearby intersection, and stopped to strap the net to the car's roof. Made of white mesh, the net ran the length of the car and was held up by a tent pole at the front, tapering to a small removable bag in the back. Drivers whizzing past twisted their heads to stare. Reese eyed his parking spot nervously as he adjusted the straps of the contraption. This is not 100% legal, he said, but I guess for the sake of science. Reese had not been able to stop thinking about the missing bugs. The more he learned, the more his nostalgia gave way to worry. Insects are vital pollinators and recyclers of ecosystems and the base of food webs everywhere. Reese was not alone in noticing their decline. In the United States, scientists recently found the population of monarch butterflies fell by 90% in the last 20 years. That's a lot of percent, and a loss of 900 million individuals. The rusty-patched bumblebee, which once lived in 28 states, dropped by 87% over the same period. 87%. With other less studied insect species, one butterfly researcher told me, all we can do is wave our arms and say it's not here anymore. Still, the most disquieting thing wasn't the disappearance of certain species of insects. It was the deeper worry shared by Reese and many others that a whole insect world might be quietly going missing. A loss of abundance that could alter the planet in unknowable ways. We notice the losses, said David Wagner, an entomologist at the University of Connecticut. It's the diminishment that we don't see. Because insects are legion, inconspicuous and hard to meaningfully track, the fear that there might be far fewer than before was more felt than documented. People noticed it by canals or in backyards or under streetlights at night. Familiar places that had become unfamiliarly empty. The feeling was so common that entomologists developed a shorthand for it. named for the way many people first began to notice that they weren't seeing as many bugs. They called it the windshield phenomenon. To test what had been primarily a loose suspicion of wrongness, Reese and 200 other Danes were spending the month of June roaming their country's back roads in their outfitted cars. They were part of a study conducted by the Natural History Museum of Denmark, a joint effort of the University of Copenhagen, Aarhus University, and North Carolina State University. The nets would stand in for the windshields as Reese and the other volunteers drove through various habitats, urban areas, forests, agricultural tracts, uncultivated open land, and wetlands, hoping to quantify the disorienting sense, that, as one of the study's designers put it, something from the past is missing from the present. When the investigators began planning the study in 2016, they weren't sure if anyone would sign up. By the time the nets were ready, a paper by an obscure German entomologist society had brought the problem of insect decline into sharp focus. The German study found that, measured simply by weight, the overall abundance of flying insects in German nature reserves had decreased by 75% over just 27 years. 75% in just 27 years. If you looked at midsummer population peaks, the drop was 82%. Reese learned about the study from a group of his students in one of their class projects. They must have made some kind of mistake in their citation, he thought, but they hadn't. The study would quickly become, according to the website Altmetric, the sixth most discussed scientific paper of 2017. Headlines around the world warned of an insect Armageddon. Within days of announcing the insect collection project, the Natural History Museum of Denmark was turning away eager volunteers by the dozens. It seemed that there were people like Reese everywhere, people who had noticed a change but didn't know what to make of it. How could something as fundamental as the bugs in the sky just disappear? And what would become of the world without them? Anyone who has returned to a childhood haunt to find that everything somehow got smaller knows that humans are not great at remembering the past accurately. This is especially true when it comes to changes in the natural world. It is impossible to maintain a fixed perspective. As Heraclitus observed 2,500 years ago, it is not the same river, but we are also not the same people. A 1995 study by Peter Kahn and Batya Friedman of the way some children in Houston experienced pollution summed up our blindness this way. With each generation, the amount of environmental degradation increases, but each generation takes that amount as the norm. In decades of photos of fishermen holding up their catch in the Florida Keys, the marine biologist Lauren McClenacon, messing that one up, McClenacon, found a perfect illustration of this phenomenon, which is often called shifting baseline syndrome. The fish got smaller and smaller to the point where the prize catches were dwarfed by fish that in years past were piled up and ignored. But the smiles on the fishermen's faces stayed the same size. The world never feels fallen because we grow accustomed to the fall. By one measure, bugs are the wildlife we know best, the non-domesticated animals whose lives intersect most intimately with our own. Spiders in the shower, ants in the picnic, ticks buried in the skin. We sometimes feel that we know them rather too well. And in another sense, though, they are one of our planet's greatest mysteries, a reminder of how little we know about what's happening in the world around us. We've named and described 1 million species of insects, a stupefying array of thrips and fire brats, and antlions and caddisflies and frog hoppers and other enormous families of bugs that most of us can't even name. Technically, the word bug applies only to the order Hemiptera, also known as true bugs, or Hemiptera, I don't know, screwing it up. Species that have tube-like mouths for piercing and sucking, and there are as many as 80,000 named varieties of those. The ones we think we know well, we don't. There are 12,000 types of ants. There are 20,000 varieties of bees, almost 400,000 species of beetles, so many that the geneticist J.B.S. Haldane reportedly quipped that God must have had an inordinate fondness for them. A bit of healthy soil, a foot square and 2 inches deep, might easily be home to 200 unique species of mites, each presumably with a subtly different job to do. And yet entomologists estimate that all this amazing, absurd, and understudied variety represents perhaps only 20% of the actual diversity of insects on our planet. That there are millions and millions of species that are entirely unknown to science. With so much abundance, it is very likely never occurred to most entomologists of the past that their multitudinous subjects might dwindle away. As they poured themselves into studies of the life cycles and taxonomies of the species that fascinated them, few thought to measure or record something as boring as their number. Besides, tracking quantity is slow, tedious, and unglamorous work. Setting and checking traps, waiting years or decades for your data to be meaningful, grappling with blunt baseline questions instead of more sophisticated ones, and who would pay for it? Most academic funding is short-term, but when what you're interested in is invisible, generational change, says Dave Goulson, an entomologist of the University of Sussex, a 3-year monitoring program is no good to anybody. This is especially true of insect populations, which are naturally variable with wide trend-obscuring fluctuations from one year to the next. When entomologists began noticing and investigating insect declines, they lamented the absence of solid information from the past in which to ground their experiences of the present. We see 100 of something and we think we're fine, Wagner says. But what if there were 100,000 2 generations ago? Rob Dunn, an ecologist at North Carolina State University who helped design the net experiment in Denmark, recently researched for studies showing the effect of pesticide spraying on the quantity of insects living in nearby forests. He was surprised to find that no such studies existed. Yeah, surprise, surprise. We ignored really basic questions, he said. It feels like we've dropped the ball in some giant collective way. If entomologists lacked data, what they did have were some very worrying clues, along with the impression that they were seeing fewer bugs in their own jars and nets while out doing experiments, a windshield phenomenon specific to the sorts of people who have bug jars and nets. There were documented downward slides of well-studied bugs, including various kinds of bees, moths, butterflies, and beetles. In Britain, as many as 30 to 60% of species were found to have diminishing ranges. Larger trends were harder to pin down, though a 2014 review in Science tried to quantify these declines by synthesizing the findings of existing studies and found that a majority of monitored species were declining on average by 45%. Entomologists also knew that climate change and the overall degradation of global habitat are bad news for biodiversity in general, and that insects are dealing with the particular challenges posed by herbicides and pesticides, along with the effects of losing meadows, forests, and even weedy patches to the relentless expansion of human spaces. There were studies of other better understood species that suggested that insects associated with them might be declining too. People who studied fish found that the fish had fewer mayflies to eat. Ornithologists kept finding that birds that rely on insects for food were in trouble. 8 in 10 partridges gone from French farmlands, 50 and 80% drops, respectively, for nightingales and turtle doves. Yeah, man, you know, it sounds like these scientists are just making this up. They're just making this up. They're just making this up. This is just, you know, they're trying to scare people into the idea that, you know, humans are causing some kind of damage. This is all just an elaborate hoax, a plan. Half of all farmland birds in Europe disappeared in just 3 decades. At first, many scientists assumed that familiar culprit of habitat destruction was at work, but then they began to wonder if the birds might simply be starving. In Denmark, an ornithologist named Anders Tottrup was the one who came up with the idea of turning cars into insect trackers for the windshield effect study after he noticed that rollers, little owls, Eurasian hobbies, and bee eaters, all birds that subsist on large insects such as beetles and dragonflies, had abruptly disappeared from the landscape. The signs were certainly alarming, but they were also just signs, not enough to justify grand pronouncements about the health of insects or as a whole, or about what might be driving a widespread cross-species decline. There are no quantitative data on insects, so this is just hypothesis. Hans de Kroon, an ecologist at Radboud university in the Netherlands explained to me, not the sort of language that sends people to the barricades. Then came the German study. Scientists were still cautious about what the findings might imply for other regions of the world, but the study brought forth exactly the kind of longitudinal data that they had been seeking, and it wasn't specific to just one type of insect. The numbers were stark, indicating a vast impoverishment of an entire insect universe, even in protected areas where insects ought to be under less stress. The speed and scale of the drop were shocking even to entomologists who were already anxious about bees or fireflies or the cleanliness of car windshields. The results were surprising in another way too. The long-term details about insect abundance, the kind that no one really thought existed, hadn't appeared in a particularly prestigious journal and didn't come from university-affiliated scientists, but from a small society of insect enthusiasts based in the modest German city Krefeld. This is a long old article, guys, and I'm going to read maybe a little bit more, and I'll probably link the rest below. But you guys get the idea of what's going on. Krefeld sits a half-hour drive outside Dusseldorf near the western bank of the Rhine. It's a city of brick houses and bright flower gardens and Stadtwald. Okay, I pronounce a couple of German things. A municipal forest and park where paddle boats float on a lake. Umbrellas shade a beer garden, and I couldn't help noticing the afternoon light through the trees illuminates small swarms of dancing insects. Near the center of the old city, a paper sign not much larger than a business card identifies the solid headquarters of the society whose research caused so much commotion. When it was founded in 1905, the society operated out of another building, one that was destroyed when Britain bombed the city during World War II. By the time the bombs fell, members had moved their precious records and collections of insects, some of which dated back to the 1860s, to an underground bunker. Nowadays, the society uses more than 6,000 square feet of an old three-story school as storage space. Ask for a tour of the collections and you will hear such sentences as, "This whole room is Lepidoptera," referring to a former classroom stuffed with what I first took to be shelves of books, but which are in fact innumerable wooden frames containing pinned butterflies and moths. And in an even larger room, every bumblebee here was collected before the Second World War, 1880 to 1930. And upon opening a drawer full of sweat bees, it's a new collection, 30 years old. On the shelves that do hold books, I counted 31 clearly well-loved volumes in the series Beetles of Middle Europe, a 395-page book that cataloged specimens of spider wasps, where they were collected, where they were stored, of the Western Palearctic, said 1948 to 2008 on the cover. I asked my guide, a society member named Martin Sorg, who was one of the lead authors of the paper, whether those dates reflected when the specimens were collected. No, Sorg replied, that was the time the author needed for this work. Sorg, who rolls his own cigarettes and wears John Lennon glasses and whose gray hair grows long past his shoulders, is not a freewheeling type when it comes to insect work. And his insect work is really all he wants to talk about. We think details about nature and biodiversity declines are important, not details about life histories of entomologists. Sorg explains, after he and Werner Stenmans, a society member whose name appeared alongside Sorg's on the 2017 paper, dismissed my question about their day jobs. Leery of an article that focused on him as a person, Sorg didn't want to talk about what drew him to entomology as a child, or even what it was about certain types of wasps that made him want to devote so much of his life to studying them. We normally give life histories when someone is dead, he said. There was a reason for the wariness. Society members disliked seeing themselves described over and over in news stories as amateurs. It's a framing that reflects, they believe, a too narrow understanding of what it means to be an expert or even a scientist, what it means to be a student of the natural world. Amateurs have long provided much of the patchy knowledge we have about nature. Those bee and butterfly studies most depend on mass mobilizations of volunteers willing to walk transects and count insects every 2 weeks or every year, year after year. The scary numbers about bird declines were gathered this way too, though, because birds can be hard to spot. Volunteers must learn to identify them by their sounds. Britain, which has a particularly strong tradition of amateur naturalism, has the best studied bugs in the world. As technologically advanced as we are, the natural world is still a very big and complex place, and the best way to learn what's going on is for a lot of people to spend a lot of time observing it. The Latin root of the word amateur is, after all, the word lover. So I'm not going to read all about Crefeld entomologists. I've already gone way off the beaten path, I think, about the actual crux of this article. But I'm going to finish up with this. What we're losing is not just the diversity of part of biodiversity, but the bio part, life in sheer quantity. While I was writing this article, scientists learned that the world's largest king penguin colony shrank by 88% in 35 years. That's more than 97% of the bluefin tuna. Oh, that more than 97% of the bluefin tuna that once lived in the ocean are gone. The number of Sophie, the giraffe toys sold in France in a single year is 9 times the number of all the giraffes that still live in Africa. If that isn't absolutely heart-wrenchingly depressing, I don't know what is. Scientists have begun to speak of functional extinction as opposed to the more familiar kind, numerical extinction. Functionally extinct animals and plants are still present, but no longer prevalent enough to affect how an ecosystem works. Some phrase this as the extinction not of a species, but of all of its former interactions with its environment. An extinction of seed dispersal and predation and pollination and all the other ecological functions an animal once had, which can be devastating even if some individuals still persist. The more interactions are lost, the more disordered the ecosystem becomes. A 2013 paper in Nature, which modeled both natural and computer-generated food webs, suggests that a loss of even 30% of a species' abundance can be so destabilizing that other species start going fully numerically extinct. In fact, 80% of the time, it was a secondarily affected creature that was first to disappear. A famous real-world example of this type of cascade concerns sea otters. When they were nearly wiped out in the northern Pacific, their prey, sea urchins, ballooned in number and decimated kelp forest, turning a rich environment into a barren one and also possibly contributing to numerical extinctions, notably of the Steller's sea cow. Okay, that's all I got time for in this video. That's all I have time for in this video to speak a little more clearly. Thank you so much for your eyes, your ears, and your conscience. If you would like to support this channel, you can do so at the links below. Until next time, peace. I will link this article below, and happy reading.